3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the Be My Guest podcast, where we interview inspiring entrepreneurs who share their stories and their insights and much, much more. You made a great choice tuning in today to the Be My Guest podcast. Welcome and enjoy the show. All right. Welcome, guys, to another episode of Be My Guest podcast. I'm your host, Frankie, and I am excited about having another guest who has some incredible things to share with us today. So I'm excited about sharing that with you. Don't forget, if you want to be interviewed, you're an inspiring entrepreneur who has a story or insights you want to share, we would love to talk to you about coming on the Be My Guest podcast. You can go to our website, BeMyGuestPodcast.com. That's BeMyGuestPodcast.com, and click on Get Interviewed, and we'll reach out to you about interviewing you right here on the Be My Guest podcast. Without further ado, I want to bring our guest on, Dr. Rosanne. Dr. Rosanne, thank you for coming and being a part of our show today.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. Well, let's take a moment here and let you introduce yourself and what you do and how you got started, and tell us a little bit about who you are.
Okay. So my history is I'm an industrial psychologist, not a therapist. That means I know what makes companies tick on the people side. And I have had lots of jobs. Most of them were 10 years at a time in corporate America, left brain. And about a year ago, I started a memoir, a book about my father, which I want to tell you about in a minute. But I wrote books way back when about the human experience in a robotic world. And this is my first book that is right brain, and it's about my relationship with my father. And this is what it looks like, and it's called Pain, Pumpernickel, and Profound Forgiveness, a daughter's story of her punishing and loving relationship with her father. And how it came about was, as my parents were getting older, I realized that I have a very small family. And when my father passed away, I wrote all the little vignettes that he and I had shared together, and I threw them in a file. Maybe I'd write a book someday. And that someday didn't happen because I lost the file and I couldn't find it. So I went, well, okay. And when I was moving from New York to Virginia, I was clearing off the top of my filing cabinet, and there were these 3-ring binders that have the plastic in the front where you have something to put in. And stuck together was the file folder with the stories. And I just went, thank you, thank you, thank you, up above. And I typed them immediately into the computer, because the last time they were in the computer was when there was dot matrix, giving my age away a little bit here. And so I decided that I was going to put it in the computer and I was going to write a book about them. But I didn't know how to write a memoir, so I took a course in memoir writing. I submitted the various vignettes, and I got really good results from the other people in the class. So I was motivated to write it. I wrote the book. I self-published the book, and it is the good, the bad, and the ugly. It was a journey of bumps in the road and incredibly healing. And the reviews that I got, I have 120 plus reviews, amazing reviews, one after the other, of how it made a difference in people's lives. And I wrote it for my family as a legacy for them to know who my father was. But I realized it was more than that. I was making a difference in people's lives, especially men. And I didn't think men would respond because I'm vulnerable and raw in my different stories. And they would say they related to X, or somebody's father was going through cancer and they were mad at him. because they didn't have time together because he was never around. And reading my book shifted his perception. And he was able to have compassion and spend those last days in a loving relationship with his father. So people got triggered back to their own history, childhood, whatever, or whatever's going on in the present. So I like the tagline, you're never too old to make peace with your past. Whether it's a spouse, whether it's a girlfriend, a boyfriend, a daughter, a son, a boss, somebody that looked at you cross-eyed on the bus or the train or the plane, because it's where it works, where life works is in the present. In the present. That's where all the goodies are, not in the past. And if we don't deal with the past, what we don't give back, we give forward. We pass it on. So there's stories in there that people have shifted their perception. There's a lot of DIs, not DUIs, DIs, divine intervention, that you couldn't make it up, and it was amazing. And so I'm pretty pleased.
Awesome. Now, you talked about giving back your past. Tell me what that means.
That means that, for example, my father was brought up to beat children. If they're not good, they got the strap. And that's my generation. And I learned that if I was bad enough, I would get the strap. If my mother punished me, I only had to stand in the corner. But if she set me up and told on me to my father, I would get the strap. And so I carried that along with me into my adulthood. And what happened is I was at a workshop on Gestalt therapy, and I was telling this story that I just told you, that if I was, really bad, this is what happened. And the guy said, stop. And he brought everyone in. You have to hear this story. And I thought, oh my God, what did I do wrong? They had me tell the story again. And then he said, you see what you have? You have contaminated listening, contaminated up here, thinking that you deserve to be beaten. Do you actually believe that children deserve to be beaten? And of course the answer was no. But I was carrying that around and I didn't know it. Now, if I fast forward, I wanted to have a conversation with my father. And I was always afraid of him because he was a rageaholic. And what I was a good girl one day, he would get mad at me the next.
Mm-hmm.
I got up really early in the morning so that my mother was still asleep. And I told my father I wanted to talk to him. And I sat with him at a kitchen table, very close. And I told him that I hated him when I was growing up, that I was very afraid of him, and that he beat me, and that no child deserves to be beaten, don't you think? And he started to cry, and he said, yes, I'm so sorry for what I did. I didn't know how to do it any different. It's what my father taught me. So that's what I mean by what you don't give back, you pass on.
Was that your moment of giving it back?
Pardon?
Was that the moment you gave it back when you spoke to your father?
Yeah. Not only did I give it back, and my father responded really well, but I realized that I was carrying it around from being in that workshop, that I didn't even know I was carrying it around, that I thought I was bad enough to be beaten.
So after
after
the workshop, you spoke to your father afterwards?
Yeah, I did. And what that allowed me to do is have a loving relationship with him from then forward.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things didn't change. We'd go places together, sometimes just the two of us, but he didn't talk. And I thought, well, I'm not gonna say anything. The only thing they ever talked about was how was school, how's the house, how are the kids, things like that, my parents. And that's because I looked it up in Wikipedia. My generation, the man was the breadwinner, the wife stayed home and took care of the children and took care of the house.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't talk about the family. You don't talk about what goes on in the family outside the family. So I thought everyone was just like me.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't true. And it wasn't that they were holding it like a secret. It was they didn't know how to do it any different.
Right.
So I ended up with some compassion for them and freedom for me that I wasn't a bad person. I just got caught up in the upbringing.
Yeah.
And that's just one. I mean, some of the stories are very nice. Some of them are humorous. Some of them are sad. And a lot of them are divine intervention. You couldn't
Yeah.
you couldn't have made it happen.
I want to go back to you speaking to your father. Did you have any reservations, or were you afraid of his response possibly being negative?
Oh, I was petrified. That's why I waited as long as I waited.
How long ago was that, if you don't mind me asking?
Probably 20 years,
20 years ago.
maybe
So
30.
you were far into being an adult, and he was
Oh,
in
I
his,
was an adult with a 12-year-old inside that was so afraid to talk to him.
Hmm.
So now, talking about the 12-year-old, that 12-year-old can grow up the more I make peace with my past. Because if I'm triggered backwards, I'm not in the present. And the reality is in the present, not in the history of what's in my head.
Yeah.
So the more I make peace, not that it's perfect, but the more I make peace, the less I have anybody living in my head rent free.
Right. Now, how did it make you feel when he responded the way he did?
First I was shocked. And then I was so happy that I had spoken it, because I thought he would have been the toughest one to get through. And it wasn't so. It wasn't so.
Were you
And then
prepared in case he didn't
yeah,
acknowledge it or wasn't negative? What would you have done if he did anything different?
I would have done, Rosanne, you were very responsible in putting forth what it was. He was either going to accept it and respond or not, but you did what you had to do. Your investment in the outcome, quote unquote, is what gets you in trouble. Because if I want to make a conversation with you and I want to make an amend, or I want to apologize, or I want something from you, or I want you to know something, I want you to get it. And if you don't get it, it's my responsibility. No, 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 no. I'm responsible for how I respond to what you do, but I'm not responsible for your feelings.
Mhm.
I'm not responsible for the outcome. And we're brought up, or I was brought up, that the outcome, I'm outer directed. You want me to be green, I'll be green. You want me to be blue, I'll be blue. Your happiness, my happiness, is determined by your mood.
Mm.
A lot of people live that way, and they walk around on tiptoes. I walked around on eggs as a child. I was a good girl one day and not a good girl the next day for the same thing that I did. So I had a lot of contamination that I thought everyone had. And it isn't like we sat down and said, let's look at our contaminations. It just happened to come out in a conversation that made an incredible, incredible contribution to my life
Yeah.
and to my father's life.
Mm. Yeah. Now, after that conversation with your father and the way it went, how pivotal was it for you in the rest of your life?
What was it?
How pivotal was it in your
Pivotal. It was
work?
very pivotal.
Yeah.
Number one, I could talk to him. I shared something with him that was deep for me. I'd never shared anything. We did surface conversations. We didn't talk about anything that mattered. And that really mattered to me. And his response really mattered to me. And there was a shift in the perception of the relationship, and there was a shift in how my father responded to me.
Mm. Mm.
And it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't major. It wasn't an amazing turnaround, but there was something there that had never been there before that wiped out all the stuff that used to get in the way.
Yeah. How did it change some of the work you did and the direction you were going with your life?
Well, that's a good question. The more I participated in life, this is my work life and this is my personal life. The more I crossed those borders and I brought who I am, not who you want me to be, who I am into the picture, I started getting really successful.
Mm.
Really successful, went up to vice president of a company that I started out as a secretary.
Mm. And that was after
Now,
the conversation with your father.
that was after the conversation with my father, and that was pivotal for me for it's okay to tell my truth.
Mm.
Because it isn't right or wrong, it's just what's so. This is the facts, this is what happened, and then this is what I made up about them
Mm.
that I
Yeah.
didn't know I made up. So I was able to dissect it and look at the boundaries that I could set to protect myself.
Yeah. What would you say to people that definitely understand they need to have conversations similar to the one you had with your father, but has reservations of their responses? What would you say to encourage them to continue to do it?
I would tell them to put on their big girl or big boy pants, take a deep breath, know what you're going to say, take notes, don't leave anything out, and then make it smaller, and then make sure that you're only responsible for your side of the table.
Yeah.
If you get invested in the outcome, you're going to get disappointed, I promise you. And then whatever the outcome is, you did what you needed to do to take care of yourself, maybe to protect yourself, and maybe just to inform the other person, when you do X, here's how it lands for me, and it upsets me, and I need you to know it. It doesn't have to be heavy stuff. It's the little things that get us going.
Yeah. So going back to giving back your past, how beneficial is it to do that? And what have you noticed when you're working with people when they haven't done that as well, how it affects them?
I can see it on their face. The lines tend to go away. The
Mm.
shoulders that are like this are like this. There's a freedom to taking care of yourself,
Mm.
even though it looks scary. There's a freedom to do it.
Wow. And you talked about how you were surprised that men had the response they did to your book. What was some of the things that they brought up to you that really helped them?
Little things. One of them was triggered by something I wrote about chess, playing chess.
Mm.
And he played chess with his father, and they never spoke. They just played. They never said a word.
Mm.
And he wanted, while his father was still alive, he wanted to go and have a conversation with him.
Yeah.
And apologize for having, these thoughts against him that he never knew about. And I can tell you that what doesn't come out directly comes out sideways.
Mm.
So they talked about the shifting of perception that was useful for them, and that they didn't realize how they were making up a story about their father that probably wasn't true. Like, I live in an area where a lot of people work for the government, and so they're traveling a lot. So there's a lot of people that don't know what their father really does because he's not allowed to tell, or B, he's not around because he's traveling for work as head of the household.
Mm.
So they have a resentment because he's not there. So their understanding of him shifted by hearing somebody else's story that was similar.
Yeah.
And the honesty and the struggle that I went through, which is evident in the book, gave them the courage and the willingness to do whatever they needed to do. And that takes down the fear, because it comes back to, what is your willingness? What are you willing to do? What
Yeah.
are you willing to have in your life? Are you willing to have a father in your life or just someone that looks like him?
Mm. What would you say to someone like for me? I didn't get a chance to really make amends with my father. He passed at 55 years old of stroke, and I did visit him in the hospital before he actually passed. But we had our last conversation was, kind of short, and we kind of had like a little bit of disagreement. But he ended up passing without having any real conversation. How do you still achieve some of the things you recommended in this type of scenario?
Okay, if the person isn't alive to make it for you to make an amend to, my suggestion, this is just my knee jerk, is to write them a letter and then take it to one of your favorite spots, the beach, the mountains, and apologize for not saying it while he was alive. But that doesn't mean that it isn't valid.
Mm.
And that if you could do it over, you would do it over. And whatever it is that you're taking ownership of, because this isn't, none of these things are about our fathers. Our father is the one that's in front of us, but it's not about our fathers, it's about us. And
Mm.
how do you get free from carrying around that load? Your mental health, your physical health, your emotional health is all impacted by what we keep inside.
Mm.
So I would, if a letter works, I'd make him a video. I'd make a ceremony about it. I'd have people around if you wanted to, family people around that could be witness to a completion that you're willing to have, that you never got to say. You're going to say it to him now, and you could read it out loud to all the people. You could ask someone to go with you because you might chicken out, and it won't be that big of a deal if you don't do it. You haven't done it yet. That whole story.
Yeah.
Why bother? So my suggestion is, if you're asking the question, that you already know the answer. If you didn't ask the question, there wouldn't be any willingness there to see something differently.
Right. Right.
So a very simple sentence, which is actually from the Course in Miracles, is, I can see this differently. That
Wow.
doesn't make him a good guy or a bad guy. It means that you can shift your perception and that you can get some relief from him living in your head rent free because you have an incompletion. If
Mm.
only you had done this, if only this had happened, if only he lived one more day, if only I had said something, if only I'd have kept my mouth shut. A lot of chatter going on there, no peace and serenity that I can hear.
Mm.
So it becomes a choice. When we were kids, we didn't have choices, we had to obey.
Right.
But as adults, we're either victims or we're volunteers. I don't want to
Mm.
volunteer anymore. I don't want anyone living in my head rent free. I don't think, if I hadn't done all the work I've done on myself and continue to do, I wouldn't look the way I look. And I'm old. I used to keep saying I'm getting older, but I've arrived. I'm old. You would not normally bring someone on, this is my guess, but you could tell me if it's true. You would not bring someone on to your podcast who was 83 years old. Because an 83-year-old, in my mind, is a woman in a black dress that sits on a rocking chair on the porch and gives $5 to the kid to go for an ice cream cone. That's my upbringing. My grandparents were all gone before I was born. So I don't know what old looks like. But I know that when something's going on inside of me, it shows all over.
Right. That's good stuff. Yeah, we don't verify age or anything like that. So that doesn't matter of fact, the older you are, the more wisdom you should be able to share with us. So we're excited to have that. So,
One would hope. One would
yeah.
hope.
I saw recently a podcast where it's kind of a daunting name, but the podcast was Right Before Death. What can you share with us? And that gentleman interviews people that, are knocking on death's door like within days or weeks. And so some great content out of that because, he's talking to people that's lived 90 to 100 years old or so and got a lot of stuff to share. Just like you, Dr. Rosanne, great stuff to share about that. Where can people find this book that you wrote? Is it Amazon or your website, or what's the best place for them
The
to find
best
them?
place is to go to Amazon, and you could just put in Pain, Pumpernickel, and Profound Forgiveness, and it'll come right up. And be sure to read the reviews because they're all very similar, but they're beautiful. I'm so touched by them that now I know that it wasn't for my family, it's for the world. It's to make a difference in everyone who's listening, everyone that's watching. Take a look at what your willingness is and look at where you're stubborn and unwilling.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, anything else you want to include before we close out today's interview?
No, I just want to repeat again that you're never too old to make peace with your past. Go for it. Go for it. The worst thing that could happen is that you cleared out all the visitors that were living in your head rent-free.
That's right. Well, this has been helpful even for me personally, and I'm sure anyone watching and listening, it'd be helpful to them as well. So make sure, guys, if watching this, you reach out to Dr. Rosanne at drrosanne.com and go get her book, Pain, Pumpernickel, on Amazon. Read the book, read the reviews. Dr. Rosanne, thank you for sharing today and coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed being here.
Thank you so much. You've been watching Being My Guest podcast. Thanks for tuning in. If you want to be a guest on our podcast, go to BeMyGuestPodcast.com. That's BeMyGuestPodcast.com.